بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العظيم. نويت تعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير، ونفي لفاني فاري استفادة، وحث تمس بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم، ودواء إلى هدى ودلالة على خير، ابتغاء وجه الله ومرضاته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. اللهم علمنا مما ينفعنا وينفعنا بما تعلمنا، وانزلنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair for those of you who joined us for our monthly Living Islam. It's actually been about 2 months because we obviously we're not doing Living Islam during the month of Ramadan because of the tartib that we were following, the aspect of fasting during the day, breaking our fast at night, doing the Salat al-Tarawih in the evenings after Isha. So we didn't have the Living Islam in the month of March. So alhamdulillah, shukillah, we are starting it back up in the month of April. And for those who may not be familiar with our Living Islam, I usually just give a brief introduction to the concept. So this is something that the Mecca Center, we developed some years ago, pre-COVID, where we made it a situation where people could come to Living Islam and be able to discuss and engage in conversations about anything that they wanted, that they felt that they wanted to discuss, but they didn't necessarily always have the space to do it in. And so there is no actual tertib, there is no actual program that we have. This is just an open discussion. And so one of the things I always like to mention is that this is not a Q&A. So this is not just a session where people just have to ask questions and then I answer them or whatever the case may be, though it's perfectly fine if people want to ask questions. But again, this is a discussion. So other people can give their experience, give their thoughts on a particular matter and so on and so forth. And I try to act as a guide throughout the conversation. So that is my little spiel, so to speak. And so, as I always like to mention in the beginning, is that the Living Islam is what we make it, so if no one has anything that they want or is on their minds or their hearts to discuss, then we can sit in each other's comfortable or uncomfortable silence for the next 2 hours with a break from Maghrib. That's my little spiel. And so I leave it to all the participants to engage and, see where the conversation leads us. Usually in my experience, the beginning always starts off slow, and then inshallah, after some time, we kind of pick up as we go. So, Bismillah. So there was someone has sent in a message. It's now the 21st day of Shawwal. Is it the 21st? Well, depending on when you did the moon sighting for the month of Shawwal. So for some people it'll be the 20th, some people it'll be the 21st. So for those that it'll be the 21st day of Shawwal, is it permissible for us to fast on Easter Sunday and Monday to make up our Ramadan days or the Shawwal 6 days? Good Friday, we're not to fast. If we fast, it has to be 2 days, Friday and Saturday, or Thursday and Friday. So the basis of the fast, it varies based upon what the fast is for. So I can give like some general fiqh questions in regards to that. So within the realm of fiqh, there are only 5 days in the sacred law that are absolutely impermissible to fast. And those 5 days are the two Eids. So we were talking about Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. And then the 3 days of Ayyam al-Tashriq, which are essentially the 3 days that come right after Eid al-Adha. So we're talking about the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th of the month of Dhul Hijjah. Those are the 5 days that is categorically impermissible for a person to fast. So fasting on those days will be impermissible. However, when it comes to fasting other than those days, then we have to look at what is the intention behind the person behind it in terms of the fast. So another general principle is that yes, the Prophet Muhammad SAW, in general, he's told us that essentially we should not single out Fridays, Saturdays, or Sundays for fasting. In particular, Fridays it's a weekly Eid. And so just like we don't fast on the two major Eids, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, is that in general, it shouldn't be a practice that we single out Friday to fast upon. And then in regards to Saturday and Sunday, these are the celebratory days of the Jews, and then Sunday being the days of the Christians. And so we don't necessarily single out those days. However, if that is not our intention, meaning that we are not singling out those days just in and of themselves, but that we are utilizing those days to fast for another intention. So as the question mentions, the aspect of making up a fast, or facilitating the sunnah of the fast of the 6 days of Shawwal, and so on and so forth, or whether it be even outside the month of Shawwal. And for example, if let's say the 10th of Muharram, which is considered to be a sunnah fast to fast on, or the 13th, 14th, and 15th of the lunar calendar come about, then, or for example, the day of Arafah, which is generally speaking, to fulfill the sunnah of fasting Arafah, you just have to fast on the day of Arafah. So in these particular cases, if those days were to have happened to have fallen on a Friday or Saturday or Sunday, then it would be considered to be permissible. Why? Because our intention is we're not specifying Friday or Saturday or Sunday to fast on, but there's something else that we're fasting for. And so this is a situation where, as long as our intention is not to fast specifically on those days, then it would be permissible for us to fast on those days. So for example, as long as a person is not fasting on Sunday for the intention of fasting on Sunday, or fasting because it's Easter, and particularly because Easter, even the concept, is a pagan holiday, and also the religious aspect of it is attributed to something that we say is false from the standpoint of Christianity, because the pagan aspect comes from all of the symbols that they use for Easter, in terms of like the bunny and the eggs and so on and so forth. Those are actually from pagan rituals. And then the aspect of the resurrection, this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can clearly rejects in the Quran. So as long as our intention is not to fast for those reasons, and I'm not thinking that anyone's necessarily fasting for those reasons, then it will be permissible to fast if our reasoning is, for example, to be able to fulfill the 6 days of Shawwal. So, for some people, it might be easier for them to fast on a weekend than it is to fast during the day. And so they may choose to fast on the weekend. But the intention being that they're trying to, make up a day that they have to make up, or they're trying to fulfill the 6 days of Shawwal, and of course it being the 21st, meaning that we only have 8 or possibly 9 more days in the month of Shawwal. And so a person may be trying to fulfill that and wants to try to take advantage of as many days as possible. Now, if you were to combine between days, meaning like you fasted more than just a Friday or more than just a Sunday and so on and so forth, yes, that can be better, because that like kind of further emphasizes that you're not singling out those days, and Allah knows best. How can one strengthen their Iman and put into practice consistent worship? And what are madhabs? So how can one strengthen their Iman and put into practice consistent worship? Interestingly enough, part of the answer to the first question is within the question itself. Is that part of the aspect of strengthening one's Iman is to continuously engage in acts of worship, even if they be little. And so this is something that we have from a hadith of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, that the most beloved things to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is those things that are consistent, even if they be little. And so the aspect of strengthening the Iman, part of it is just doing that, is that having, and usually the example that I give is the example of someone that goes to the gym or something like that to do some type of exercise, is that generally speaking, when a person goes to the gym, they don't go to the gym and try to lift the heaviest thing they can right off the bat. Is that what happens? In general, what you do is that you go and you lift something that is manageable for you. So meaning that something is not too light, but also is not too heavy. And you do that, and you continue to do that until that weight all of a sudden is no longer just manageable, but it becomes easy. And then once you come to a point where now that weight is easy, then you add on to it, but only in a small increment. And usually it's going to be no more than 5 pounds at a time. So meaning that you're only going to add, like for example, if you're using a barbell, you're only going to add 2.5 pounds on each side. So that in total, you're only adding 5 pounds.
I want to listen to it. I'm just going to listen to it.
So in total, you're only adding 5 pounds. And so similarly, from the standpoint of spiritual ibadah, from the standpoint of spiritual ibadah, is that in the very beginning, you want to do that which is actually manageable. And so one of the things that I usually suggest for people is that when it comes to Islam, particularly when a person is new to Islam or they're recommitting to Islam, or whatever the case may be, is that if we haven't been in a situation of regularly participating in acts of ibadah, then my usual advice to them is to just make it a situation where we just try to make sure that we're praying the 5 daily prayers consistently and not necessarily worrying about much after that. So that if we are in a situation where we're not consistently praying our 5 daily prayers, then we make that our priority. And what we do is that we start off by one day, just making sure that we pray all 5 prayers. And we mark down the day that we're going to start. So, let's say that a person was going to say, okay, I'm going to start praying all my 5 daily prayers tomorrow, Sunday the 20th of April. So what that person would do is that they would mark down that, okay, this is the first day I'm starting, and they would make it their business to fulfill that particular goal. Is that every day they're going to make sure that they're praying every prayer consistently in their proper time, all 5 daily prayers. And they do this until they come to a point where they have 40 consecutive days where they've done this. And this principle, and this is a principle that people even use outside of like spirituality, like even from the standpoint of dunyawi aspects, is that they generally speaking, they say that it takes between 30 and 40 days for something to become a habit, meaning that it just becomes the part of you. And so this is what I usually suggest for people, is that don't worry about any other acts of ibadah or anything like that. Just first worry about the prayer. That, make the obligatory prayer your focal goal if that's not already consistent. Once you're consistent with that, so you've gone 40 days, and then now it's become a regular practice, it's a regular habit. You don't even feel right if you miss praying your prayers on time every day. Now at that point, now you might add just a slight bit more. So after you fulfill that 40 days of the obligatory prayer, Then after that, now I might add in the sunnahs associated with that prayer. So meaning that now I might add praying the 2 rakahs before Fajr, and then adding in praying the 2 or 4 rakahs before Dhuhr, and then praying the 2 rakahs after Dhuhr, and then praying the 2 rakahs after Maghrib, and then praying the 2 rakahs after Isha, and then ending it all with Witr. And I do the same thing with that I mark my calendar on the first day that I'm going to start, and I try to maintain this consistently for 40 days, such that, again, it becomes something that I regularly become used to. And this way, it will be something that I can maintain over the long haul. But again, this aspect is that we do things incrementally. We don't necessarily try to take on a whole bunch of worship at the start, such that we leave it off right in the midst of trying to keep up with it. That we first start off with something that we can manage, and if it's a situation of the obligations take precedence. So that's why I mentioned the 5 daily prayers, and I'm not saying that the person that was asking this question is a person that doesn't pray their 5 daily prayers, but in general, we have people who may not be praying their 5 daily prayers. So we're going to start there. And if a person's already consistently praying their 5 daily prayers, then they can choose something else that they're going to start with, whether it's going to be adding additional sunnah prayers. And if they're already doing the sunnah prayers, then okay, then maybe we're going to add in the duha prayer. That, if the person's not praying Salatul Duha, then now we're going to add in the Duha prayer. If a person's already doing that, then maybe we're going to start adding in fasting the 13th, 14th, and 15th of every lunar calendar month, and so on and so forth. But it's a thing of making it a situation where we come to a point where that act of worship is easy before we move on to trying to add anything else to that. Now, other aspects of strengthening Iman is we can still go back looking at the weightlifting example. Is that one of the things that is the most difficult about exercise or going to the gym in particular is just the ladder, meaning that the hardest part is usually just going to the gym. Is that oftentimes we might get lazy, we don't feel like it, we'll make an excuse, I'm too busy, and so on and so forth. And so one of the ways to combat that is that you have good people around you who will be a means of reminding you of that obligation or of that good deed that you're trying to be consistent in. So the other aspect that helps in strengthening Iman is to be in righteous company as much as you can. So the thing is that this ideally would take place in person, so that as much as you're able to, and this is part of the wisdom in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you can say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by means of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam commanding us to do certain things in congregation. That the prayer prayed in congregation is considered to be much greater than the prayer that is prayed individually. That going to Salatul Jum'ah is an obligation for the men, but it's still recommended for the women. That on the days of Eid, that we gather together with the community, and that there are other times in general. So for example, it's considered to be a sunnah to visit people, that when a person is sick, that you go visit them, or that when a person invites you to their homes, that it becomes more or less an obligation to accept the invitation, except with an excuse, so on and so forth. Is that there's a wisdom in there being so many things that are either obligatory or emphasized, meaning that is highly recommended in terms of spending time with others. And again, the basis of it is that you want to spend time with the righteous, because by spending time amongst those who are righteous, it will help to increase you in your Iman. Because the righteous, they're only going to be concerned with what? Those things that are good and pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so even if you don't necessarily take on their habits, just being in their company, it will be beneficial. Why? Because they're going to be encouraging and facilitating an environment that inshallah is going to be pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The next aspect of that concept is that if a person is in a situation where they can't, meaning they don't have the physical capacity to go and be amongst righteous people. Then in our day and time, the next possibility is kind of like this, is that if you can't physically be with people, then you can look for virtual opportunities that can be of benefit. And so, for example, oftentimes with sisters, I will recommend that they can utilize the Rabata, which was started by Auntie Tamara Gray, because they have programs specifically designed for sisters, in which one of the primary goals of it is to help to increase people in their Iman and encourage them to righteousness. And also for the brothers is that there are other similar online platforms that are utilized in order to try to help to strengthen people in their Iman. So for example, Al-Maqasid, which is not too far from my home, is that they will, generally speaking, have programs for both brothers and sisters that are meant to be means of increasing their Iman. And then if a person is not even able to do that, then what is also mentioned is that if you can't physically be with righteous people, or for whatever reason, even virtually, it becomes difficult to be around righteous people, then the other avenue is that you read the books of the righteous, that you keep the company of the righteous, of those who have passed away. And that is another means that the ulama mentioned in terms of keeping good company. And so reading their books, reading their biographies, this is another way of a person strengthening their Iman so that they will start to want to be like these righteous that they read about. And the greatest of the righteous that you can read about is the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So reading about his seerah, meaning his biography, reading about his shama'il, his character traits, all of these are means of increasing our Iman and being amongst the righteous, because again, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he is the greatest of the righteous. He is the Imam of the Bani Adam. He is the Sayyid of Bani Adam. He is the master of the children of Adam. And so he is the greatest of the righteous. All the righteous, all they're trying to do is they're trying to be like him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is another means of a person strengthening their Iman. And then another aspect in terms of strengthening their Iman, another aspect of strengthening one's Iman is to do one's best to do what's referred to in the spiritual realm as muraqabah. Muraqabah meaning to watch over the self, meaning that I do a spiritual overhaul of myself, meaning I look to see what faults I may be struggling with, and I make a plan to try to remove those faults from me. And so this is another aspect of strengthening one's Iman, is that we want to come to a point where sins are things that are few and far in between. And we say it that way because the aspect of being completely free of sin is only reserved for the prophets. That, as the Messenger of Allah informed us, "Quli bani Adam khata wa khayra qatta'in at-tawwabun," that all the children of Adam will make mistakes, will essentially commit sins, and the best of those who make mistakes are those who turn in repentance. And so trying to rid ourselves from those things that would be hindrances to our Iman. And the thing is that this has to do with all the different aspects of our lives. So what this means is, again, trying to avoid those things that are disliked, or even worse, those things that are forbidden. And this has to do with all the different aspects that we deal with. So this includes the things that we allow ourselves to see and to hear. So, for example, that if we are a person that regularly engages in looking at the small screen, whether that's going to be on a television, a tablet, a computer, a cell phone, whatever the case may be, we want to really start paying attention and being mindful of what it is that we allow ourselves to see and hear. Because if we're regularly allowing for ourselves to see and hear the haram, it's going to have an effect upon our heart. Similarly, even when we go about our other daily functions. So even when we eat, we want to make sure that we're eating in a way that is halal and permissible, that we don't want to go beyond the bounds. So for example, we many of us may be familiar with the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, in which he mentions that the worst vessel that a person can fill is their stomach. And then he mentions is that it's enough for a person that they only have a few bites to keep their back straight, meaning that they just have a few morsels so that they don't have the pangs of hunger which causes a person to bend over. But he said that if you must, and this is the maximum, because sometimes we get this confused as being the recommendation, but no, the Prophet is saying this is the maximum if you have to have more than just a few morsels, is that he says that you only have a third for your food, a third for drink, a third for air. And so the thing is that some of the ulama, and I'm not saying this is not something that's necessarily qat'i, meaning that it's not necessarily something that is absolute, but some of the ulama have taken the opinion that for a person to eat more than that amount, meaning that if they were to eat more than 1/3 of food, 1/3 for drink, and 1/3 for air, that would actually be haram. Because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is informing us that essentially that this is things that can cause harm. And so even from the standpoint of how we eat, that can have an effect upon our Iman. And so again, this aspect of trying to look at our lives and seeing what is in our lives that may be contrary to those things that are pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and trying to rid ourselves of those things. And the greatest means of all of this is that a person finds a spiritual teacher that can take them upon the spiritual path and open up these doors for them. Because in particular, when we're talking about the aspect of muraqabah and taking oneself to account and so on and so forth, oftentimes it's hard to do when we're just trying to do it with ourselves. Because oftentimes the nafs, the ego, can convince us all that we're the greatest things in sliced bread. So if you wanted to kind of sum up everything I said, then it would be a situation of if a person can find a spiritual teacher who can help and assist them in that, because the spiritual teacher will be able to extrapolate everything that I mentioned. And there was someone who actually mentioned that I believe it was in Atomic Habits, but it mentioned that one should have easy wins when it comes to making new habits, so that we know that it's manageable and feel successful. This way we're able to sustain the habit and keep going, and then can build from there. Yes, definitely. The aspect of having, and this is what people say even about the aspect of making goals, is that you make reasonable goals and you make reasonable means of obtaining it. So meaning like if, for example, and I'm just giving as an example, if a person's ultimate goal is to buy a house, right, then they should have minor goals along the way that's going to get them to that point. And so like a minor goal could be that I'm first going to create a budget that I have to stick to so I can be able to start saving for this house. So that's the first goal. The first goal is just creating a budget in and of itself. So like now you have something that you're going to be reaching for that's going to get you to that ultimate goal. And then the next goal that you might set for yourself is that, okay, now I have to stick to that budget for the next 2-3, I have to stick to that budget this week. So that's going to be your next, small win. And then the next goal is going to be to stick to that budget to the second week, all the way up until you get to the month, to 1 month. And then so like the buildup was to get to this second major goal of having you fulfill the aspect of maintaining that budget for that month, and so on and so forth. And so yes, that is definitely another means of making sure that a person can maintain different habits that they take on, particularly if those habits are not things that we necessarily incline towards. And that's another thing that we can mention, is that not every, when it comes to why is spiritual works often difficult for us, is because for many of us, we've been in a situation where we haven't been in environments that have been conducive to building up our ruh. When I'm talking about the ruh, I'm talking about that which is connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so because that is our reality, we've spent a good chunk of our lives doing the complete opposite, where we build up our nafus, we build up our egos and our desires. So now when we try to change that, our nafs is having a fit. Like, what are you doing? I want to do X, Y, and Z that we've been doing all of our lives, and now you're talking about doing some act of ibadah or some act of worship that I can't necessarily see the fruits from, like, this is not entertaining to me, and so on and so forth. So that becomes a hindrance in that, is because, again, we've strengthened our ego so much that our ruh is now weakened. And so in those initial stages, it's a situation where we're trying to strengthen our ruh. And so that is not always going to be a fun process for many people. But as one of the ulama have mentioned, is that he said, for 20 years, I tasted the bitterness of getting up and praying in the middle of the night, meaning getting up and praying tahajjud. And then he said after that, for the next 20 years, I tasted his sweetness. Meaning that he struggled with himself to get up in the middle of the night to pray tahajjud for 20 years. But after doing that with himself and continuously going against his desires not to do it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala finally opened up for him that realization, and he could see the fruits of getting up to pray in the night and for tahajjud. And so at that point, it became something that was beloved to him. So that's why he mentions that for 20 years, I felt the bitterness of getting up to pray tahajjud. And then after that, for 20 years, I tasted the sweetness. But yes, small victories along the way help to get to those goals. The other thing that was mentioned is, someone asked, what are madhabs? Seems like every so often we get this question, a madhab.
I know madhab is like, I got it like this 100%.
So a madhab, just in a short explanation of it, this is a school of law within the predominantly Sunni tradition, but even the Shiite tradition, they have madhabs. But from the standpoint of the Mecca Center, we come from the Sunni tradition. And so from the Sunni tradition, a madhab is going to be one of 4 that have remained with us from the times of their founders. So the basis of a madhab is that these were founded by imams early on in the early days of Islam. So for example, one of the earliest fuqaha that is considered to be a founder of a madhab is Abu Hanifa. And Abu Hanifa, he was, generally speaking, considered to be a tabi'i, meaning that he met some of the Sahaba, but he did not meet the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so you can see that, this is going, very early on in Islamic history. And so the 4 schools of law that we have today, these are the schools of law that were maintained by the students of these initial founders all the way up until our times today. So those 4 schools of law are in order: the Hanafi madhab, the Maliki madhab, the Shafi'i madhab, and the Hanbali madhab. Now, there were more madhabs in this, meaning that there were more fuqaha, there were more mujtahid imams, meaning imams who were capable of giving legal verdicts directly from the primary sources. However, their schools of law did not maintain throughout time. So for example, Imam al-Thawri is considered to have had his own madhab, and others. However, their madhabs were not maintained through the trials of time. However, these 4 were. And so in general, the scholars of Sunni Islam consider that these 4 schools of law, they essentially encompass the Sharia. So when we say Sharia, we're talking about the actual rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually has legislated to be the correct way that the believers should go about their actions. However, the schools of law, they are focused on the aspect of fiqh. Fiqh, that is the interpretation of the Sharia. This is why you have differences of opinion within the madhab. Because what's happening here is that the different schools of law are interpreting what the Sharia is actually saying on a particular issue, and they may come to differences of opinion. But again, the scholars of Sunni Islam, they consider that within the four schools of law, you have the entirety of the Sharia. That between the Hanafi, the Shafi'i, the Maliki, the Hanbali school, is that those areas where they differ, one of them is actually correct, if it's a situation where they all have a difference of opinion. Now, the thing is that the bulk of issues, there is not much in terms of difference of opinion on. However, there can be slight differences in certain aspects. So, for example, in the different schools, it's considered to be recommended differently in terms of where you place the hands in the prayer. However, the thing is that the validity of the prayer is not going to be necessarily affected by the different positions that you may place the hands in the prayer. And, there are other matters that may be differed upon. However, it's also considered to be a situation where a Muslim who is a general Muslim, they will not be held accountable for following one of the four schools of law. Meaning that even if an imam has made a mistake, meaning that they weren't necessarily correct in their position, that is considered to be the position of the school of law, the person that's following that school of law is not considered to be sinful because he's following qualified scholarship. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, that ask the people of remembrance if you know not. And so this is also supported by a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which he informed us that for the scholar who is qualified and they give a legal verdict, they give a ruling on a matter, if they are correct, they receive two rewards. They receive the reward for striving to come to that ruling, and they also receive the reward for being correct. But if a qualified scholar strives to come up with a legal ruling and they are not correct, then they receive one reward. They receive the reward for their striving, but they don't receive the reward for being correct. And then there are also certain issues where the interpretation can actually be correct even when there's opposing views. And we see this also from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, in which the Prophet ﷺ had told the Sahaba not to pray Asr until they reached Bani Qurayza. And those familiar with the story, you would know that essentially what happened is that the Sahaba, they differed. Is that as they were on their way to Bani Qurayza, they realized that if they were to wait until they got to Bani Qurayza to pray Asr, is that they would miss Asr outside of his time. So they debated amongst themselves. Some said that the Prophet ﷺ, he meant it as emphasis, but he would never have us miss the prayer outside of his time. Others said, the Prophet ﷺ said, do not pray Asr. So we're not going to pray Asr. He gave us a command, and we've been commanded to follow the Messenger of Allah ﷺ. So they split. Some prayed Asr in its time while they were traveling, and another group of them, they waited until they got to Bani Qurayza, and they got there and Asr had actually gone out. So they had to pray Asr, and then they had to pray Maghrib, but it was all in the time of Maghrib. So eventually they came back to the Prophet ﷺ and asked him who was correct. And the Prophet ﷺ did not rebuke either one. He affirmed both of their opposing viewpoints. And so again, the madhabs, essentially, if you want me to sum it up and not be as long-winded, this is the simple way for a Muslim to be able to practice their religion without trying to become their own personal scholar. Because, for example, if a person is new to Islam, or a person is learning about Islam and they need to know how to make wudu, if I tell them, okay, you have to look in the Quran in Surah Al-Ma'idah, and then you have to look in the Sahih of Imam Bukhari, Muslim, and also look into the Jama' Imam Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah and Abu Dawood and Nisa'i, and go through all the different babs of wudu and look at all the different narrations that have been mentioned about wudu in those particular books, and then have to do your own level of ijtihad to figure out what you're going to do when you have opposing views, and then try to figure out if certain things are requirements or recommendations. So for example, even if I told you to go to Surah Al-Ma'idah to look at the verse of wudu, then the question is going to be okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to do 4 things, but do I have to have an intention when I make wudu for the wudu to be valid? Or do I have to go in the exact order that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in this particular verse? Or can I just go in whatever order that I need to? Or I don't have to know about the different variations in qira'ah, the different variations in the recitation of Quran, because that will also change the meaning as well. And so, like, most people are not trying to do all that, especially like just to know how to make wudu. And so the madhabs, what they do is that they just make it easy for a person to know that they have qualified scholarship that have done the heavy work for them and have told them, this is how you make a valid wudu. This is how you make a valid prayer. This is what you need to know about business transactions so you can make sure that you're not engaged in haram transactions and so on and so forth. And so generally speaking, the schools of law were more regionally focused. So for example, if you go to Mauritania, the people are going to primarily be following the Maliki school. If you go to India or Pakistan, the people are going to be primarily following the Hanafi school. You go to Yemen or Malaysia or Indonesia, the people are going to be following the Shafi school primarily. You go to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the people are going to be following the Hanbali method primarily. In America, we have all 4 plus more. But typically speaking, in majority Muslim countries, you have one of the 4 that usually is more predominant than the other schools of law. And I mean, even for example, some people say that Imam Bukhari may have been a mujtahid, and that his Sahih, the Sahih of Imam Bukhari, was an indication of his fiqh preferences. But that's debated, because some would also say that Imam Bukhari was a Shafi'i. but yeah, there were definitely more than 4 schools of law. And so, for example, I've spent the majority of my life studying the Shafi school, but now I study Hanafi fiqh. Which is almost like night and day. For some of those who are just joining us, again, we are just engaging in conversation, so please feel free to please feel free to
ask questions,
join in. You can type in the chat, you can unmute yourselves. You know, this is an open discussion, so ahlan wa sahlan. I'm the only one in my family for right now that is Muslim, mashallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give your family guidance, bi'idhnillah. And I don't go to any particular mosque. I was wondering what I would do to make it known to my family that my wishes are in regards to my burial, and then who would I talk to from the Islamic side? This is something that a lot of people struggle with. And so my ultimate advice to a person, especially in that type of situation where a person doesn't have any Muslim relatives, and it's very possible that their non-Muslim relatives may try to bury them in a way that is not according to Islamic law, is that to go about making yourself a will and having it notarized so that it has a legal bearing within the court systems. Because essentially that's going to be the only surefire way that you have to ensure that your rights to your burial, your proper burial, will be able to be carried out. Because the thing is that I've heard of many different situations of this issue coming up. Because even if, like, for example, you tell your local mosque or the imam or things of that nature that you want to be buried this way, from a legal standpoint in America, the family is generally speaking going to be given precedence. And so you're not necessarily going to have like, for example, the Islamic center or the masjid or the imam or whoever is not going to have the capacity to negate your family's wishes for your burial if there's no legal documentation from you saying that this is how you want to be buried. So the primary aspect would be to have a will, and this is actually a sunnah in Islam anyway. This is actually Sunni Islam anyway. It's that the Prophet he recommended that a Muslim should not go to sleep without having a will. So I would recommend, and they in many different places have like sample wills and things like that, and also they also have workshops. Like, for example, some of the emails that I sometimes get from different Islamic centers and stuff like that, they'll mention about workshops or individuals who will help with a person writing up an Islamic will and having it notarized. So, but the key is to also have it notarized so that it has legal bearing within the judicial system. Because and again, like I've seen, because this was an issue that we had when I was working in the prisons, because we had issue where, for example, some of the inmates who were Muslim, they didn't have any family. So even if, so there wasn't even a question of, talking to the family to make sure that their wishes to be buried as a Muslim. Like, some of them didn't have any family. And the default for the prison system is that if a person died as an inmate and they didn't have anyone to claim the body, is that most of the times they were just cremating them. And so, of course, cremation is definitely not permissible from Islam. So we were actually, the imams, when, again, I don't work in the prison system anymore, but when I was there, we were making up a document to be legally binding that we would work with different Islamic centers and Muslim burial sites, such that if an inmate who was Muslim passes away while in custody and no one claims their body, that the Islamic burial organization would fulfill the rights of the Islamic burial. But again, this is something that I would definitely say to draw up a will and have it legally notarized so that that can be legally binding, so that if there does become an issue when that time comes, you have legal representation to have your rights fulfilled. Wallahu a'lam. A sister recently informed me that we cannot inherit items / wealth from our non-Muslim family members. My family is Baptist. Is this accurate? So this is something that there's ijma' upon, there's consensus upon. This is something that we have directly from the Nas of the Kitab, and we have it directly from the Quran and the Sunnah, where the inheritance is only between a Muslim and a Muslim, or a non-Muslim and a non-Muslim. However, this is not absolute in the sense that there's never a possibility of a person receiving some type of inheritance from a non-Muslim. So when we're talking about the aspect of a Muslim not inheriting from a non-Muslim, that is just from the standpoint of, like, as a default, meaning that as a default, a Muslim does not inherit from a non-Muslim. However, if a person who is Muslim has a non-Muslim relative and they bequeath to them, they leave a will and they say that I want so-and-so, meaning someone who's a Muslim, to have X, Y, and Z of my property, then in that particular situation, it is acceptable to receive whatever it is that they may be inheriting to you, as long as it's not haram. Yani, if they say that I'm giving you my pig farm, then yani, you wouldn't, you wouldn't necessarily take that or keep that. But that is a means of the possibility of a Muslim, quote unquote, inheriting from a non-Muslim, meaning that if that non-Muslim relative, for example, writes in their will that I want for this individual who is Muslim to have X, Y, and Z, then that would be permissible to take. But it has to be something that has been written or that has been, they have some type of will, whether it be verbal or written, to say that I want for so-and-so who is Muslim to have X, Y, and Z. But again, as a default, then yes, a Muslim does not inherit from a non-Muslim and a non-Muslim does not inherit from a Muslim. And on the flip side, a Muslim, if they have non-Muslim relatives that they want to leave some of their wealth behind, is that they can do the same thing, in that after a person pays off their debts and their inheritors receive their share of inheritance, a person can designate that 1/3 of their wealth that they're going to be leaving behind can go to whoever it is that they wish. So for example, this is a recommendation sometimes that ulama recommend for people who may have non-Muslim children, that they make a recommendation that if you have non-Muslim children, that you can make a wasiyah, you can make a bequeath that 1/3, a portion of that 1/3, or possibly even the whole 1/3, is going to go to this particular child, for example.
Okay, may I make a follow-up? I'm so sorry. This is more, I know this is more like financial questions that I'm asking, but if the family, non-Muslim family has an estate and they appoint the Muslim family member as like the executor of the estate, is that permissible?
If they wrote that in their will or they wrote that in some type of legally binding situation, then yes, that's permissible.
Okay. But they haven't passed away. If it's done while they're still living and they're saying this is the person I want to handle my affairs. Sorry?
To divide up the wealth ultimately.
Right,
And,
exactly.
Yeah. So again, if they bequeath that they want you to take care of that responsibility and so on and so forth, that is permissible. And what you can do to kind of like make it like fully Sharia compliant is that, okay, tell me how you want this to go, especially if they're still alive. Like, tell me, okay, is there something that you want for me to have for myself? And then is there something that you want for, Joe to have? Is there something that you want for Jane to have? And so on and so forth. And the thing is that I would actually recommend doing that because one of the greatest family feuds that you'll see has to do with inheritance. And this is one of the wisdoms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informing us of the rulings of inheritance very clearly in the Quran. So this way we won't have like family strife about who gets the house, who gets the car, and so on and so forth.
Any tips for initiating those discussions? Because every time I bring it up with my mother, she's like, "Oh, you think I'm gonna die?" Do you have? You know how like
I mean,
black people are sometimes.
I mean, the thing is that as I always, it seems like I always bring up this quote from my teacher when it's talking about relatives. Like my teacher will say everything is relative except for the relatives; they're absolute. But the thing is that I can give general advice, but the thing is that everyone knows their family members more than someone who's on the outside. So it's one of those things where you would kind of try to look to see, okay, what is the best way that my mother can handle this? And sometimes what it would be is just like kind of emphasizing from the get-go. It's like, look, I'm not trying to bring about your death. Like, I hope that you live long. I want you to live long. I want you to be here with me. But whenever that time comes, I want to be prepared so that we won't have any issues, afterwards. And so this is just for me, since you want me to be the one to execute it, just for me to have an idea of how you want things to go, so that you can feel comfortable, even, in the time that you may pass away, that you can feel comfortable that everything is going to be taken care of the way that you want it. But how you might try to kind of bring that about in terms of your personal mother, it may be varied than that. But usually, like, if you emphasize the aspect of, like, this is not coming from the aspect of me looking for you wanting to die, but this is coming from the aspect of me wanting for you to be around, but wanting to make sure that I'm doing what will be pleasing to you, once you may no longer be here. Someone had mentioned the second, I just finished making up missed fast for Ramadan. I want to fast for 6 days of Shawwal, but I'm not able to fast right now. Does the Maliki madhab allow for doubling the intention? In the Shafi'i, the Maliki madhab, if I'm not mistaken, and I just heard this recently, so don't quote me on this in terms of this being the official position in the Maliki madhab, but I did hear this recently, that in the Maliki school, they consider the aspect of fasting 6 days after Ramadan to not be limited to Shawwal. That essentially you can do it at any point in time after Ramadan is over, with that intention. However, many of the other schools would say that the fasting of the 6 days after Ramadan need to be within Shawwal. Is recommended not to double the intention. However, for example, in the Shafi school, there is the possibility of doubling the intention, but it's considered to not be recommended. So what a person could do is that if they're trying to be more precautious and still fast the 6 days of Shawwal, they can just make the intention to fast the Sunnah fast for the 6 days of Shawwal, and then after the month of Shawwal, they can make up their fast. Because the making up the fast, the most strict opinion will say that you at least have until the next coming Ramadan to make it up. Is there a workshop or class to learn how to pray janazah prayers and perform ghusl on a deceased sister? Oftentimes there are in like local, so I see, mashallah. So yeah, usually like in local massages and things like that, you have those type of things. But like the Mecca Center itself, we don't. I think there was a time where the Mecca Center did have a janazah prep situation, but again, usually local masajids or sometimes they'll just have an event taking place of learning how to wash and shroud. And the recommendation is that everyone, at least some point in time in your life, that you wash and shroud someone. It's a very humbling experience if you've never experienced it. If the non-Muslim parents leave a house, but not the liquor. If the non-Muslim parents leave a house, yes, but not the liquor store. Yeah, so you can't, or they can sell the liquor store and make it halal. So the thing is that, like for example, in the Shafi'i school of law, that which is impermissible for us is not permissible for us to give or to sell to other people. So for example, the example I usually give is that when I used to work in corporate America, one of the common gifts that people seem to always like to give is a bottle of alcohol. And so like if someone were to gift a Muslim a bottle of alcohol, it's not a thing where you can like give it to a non-Muslim person that that drinks, or that you can sell it to someone. That actually you would just have to dispose of it altogether. So the basis is that that which is haram for us is also haram for us to give to other people. And the part of the basis of that is that essentially when we say that something is haram, we're saying that this is something that if you were to engage in this action, that it would lead a person to the hellfire. So if something is haram for us, it's not befitting for us to give it to someone else and say like, look, I don't want to go to hell, but here, if you want to, go ahead. So that's kind of like the basis of it. So like those things that are haram for us is not, in general, it's not permissible for us to give to other people. And that's actually part of the care and the concern that we're supposed to have for other people, is that we're trying to guide people away from the haram, not facilitate for them to engage in the haram. So for example, if a person were to, if a person were to have a relative bequeath to them a liquor store, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save us from that type of situation. But if that was the case, then that person would just have to get rid of it, or like, they would remove themselves from the ownership of it. Or like if they were to take the building itself and like transform it into some type of other store, grocery store or something like that. Back to a question of inheritance. My father passed away and left his May Allah make it easy for you. And left his inheritance half to me and half to my brother. Is that so your father, he was Muslim? Okay. So okay. So there's a few questions. So the aspect of inheritance is that it has there are certain individuals who are referred to as the necessary inheritors, and then you have the person who's going to be the asaba, who's going to be the universal inheritor. So there's a few questions, like if you want me to be specific about the answer to this question, there's a few things that I would have to know about your family dynamic. So did your father have a wife that he left behind after his death?
Assalamu alaikum. Yes, my mother is still alive.
Okay, and they were married at the time of his death.
Yes.
So, and again, my condolences to your family, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for you and raise his darajat in his grave and on the day of Qiyamah. So first and foremost, your mother, she is the recipient of her fixed amount, which is going to be 1/8 of his inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make sure I don't say the wrong thing, because it's very easy for me to slip up on the amounts, because everything is basically cut in half when there's a person that supersedes that person. But if I'm not mistaken, if there's no children involved, the mother receives 1/4, and then if there are children involved, that's when it gets cut to half, to 1/8. So I'm just going back to double check. And of course, I have to go back a good deal. So basically, what I'm looking for is that one of my teachers, he gave us an Excel inheritance cheat sheet. So I'm trying to go back to find it. Just bear with me 1 second. And of course, when I need to find it, I can't. All right, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Yeah, I figured that there'd be many different people who already had it. So, okay, so yes, I was right, but I just wanted to double check. So your mother, she's going to receive 1/8 because you have because your father left children. Your mother is going to receive 1/8, so she has a guaranteed 1/8 of the inheritance. Now, is it just you and your brother that are left?
It's just me and my brother, and my children and his adopted children. But his adopted children are not Muslim.
Okay,
Uh, so I don't know.
okay,
Everyone says different things.
okay. So did he leave any type of will?
Yeah, he
Uh,
left the will, and the will says, half to my mother, and then the other half to my brother and I equally. And now, if the inheritance right now is going to be sold, how does it get divided up so that it's fair for everybody and
so,
not,
so the thing
and
is
not,
that
and it's also halal compliant.
yeah. So the thing is that
Hmm.
unfortunately, your father he didn't do the division
Yes, yes,
correct.
that's what. Hmm.
So your mother she receives 1/8 of the inheritance,
Okay.
and then because there's no other inheritance, like is his parents alive?
No, everybody's deceased. His siblings are basically deceased. No brothers are alive.
Okay. So the thing
Hmm.
is that the siblings they wouldn't receive anything
Hmm.
because he has children.
Hmm.
However, so in this case, the basic aspect would be is that your mother's going to receive 1/8, and
Hmm.
then after you separate that 1/8
Hmm.
from inheritance amount, then your brother is going to receive twice as much as you,
Right.
and that
Yes.
would be the basic. That would be the way that the inheritance is going to be split up.
Okay. That's
So
good.
whatever remains after that 1/8 is given to your mother,
Hmm.
you would basically divide that by three. And like you said, your brother's going to get 2/3 and you're going to get 1/3.
Hmm. Okay.
And so that's how it would be divided.
That's perfect. Thank you.
No problem.
Sorry, ma'am, I ask a follow-up
Mhm.
question then? So, since the sister's father did not, it wasn't divided properly in the will, Islamically, how do you deal with it? And then legally, how do you deal with it? Because if it's something that was written in a legal document, I'm not, let's say hypothetically, I don't know what the particular situation is, but hypothetically, if it was legally written, can, how do you go back, other than obviously the, like having good faith and people, you know, doing what they should do Islamically, how does that play out like legally in the American judicial system?
So from American judicial system, it's not going to play out because the American judicial system is just going to go by whatever the legal document is.
Right.
So so basically what happened is that you would inform the Muslim parties that are the inheritors that because the basis in Islam is that there's no obedience to the creation and disobedience to the creator. So if a person makes a mistake in terms of the rights of someone else, then the rights of Islam supersede whatever they may have legislated themselves. So basically, what would happen, and I don't necessarily want to use anyone, so let's just say that you had another family, and there was some miscalculations in terms of the inheritance. What would happen is that you would inform the inheritors, and you would have to redistribute the wealth accordingly. Now, if you had some of the family members, some of the inheritors who did not wish to, then that would actually be a sin upon them, And that would be actually a major sin, because essentially what they would be doing is that they would be essentially stealing from generations. And the reason why they say that is because when you misappropriate the inheritance, it's not just the inheritors at that moment, but it's also the inheritors of those inheritors, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a major, and this is, again, this is part of the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has clearly legislated what the rulings of inheritance are, because of the great amount of conflict that comes about with inheritance. So if a person makes a mistake in writing down how they want their inheritance to be split, then you would just inform the family, and hopefully you wouldn't have an issue once you are clearly, because as it was mentioned in the chat, is that the bulk of the rulings of inheritance can be found in Surah Nisa. It's part of the reason why many of the people that I know who memorize Quran say Surah Nisa is one of the hardest surahs to memorize. But outside of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has clearly outlined the rulings of inheritance in Surah Nisa. And so the basis of the situation is that you should hopefully easily be able to go to someone and just show them, like, look, this is clearly written in the Quran that this is how the inheritance is supposed to be split up. And hopefully you wouldn't have an issue with that. If you did have an issue in regards to that, you wouldn't go to the American court system. You would try to go to some local ulama, or if they have a Sharia board. I know like New York has a Sharia board, and others. Like, you would try to go to one of those locations to try to see if they may be able to convince the parties involved to essentially do the right thing and split the inheritance according to Islamic law. But yeah, I always, because you only get asked inheritance questions sometimes, and so it's always easier for me to sometimes forget. But yeah, so in the case of a death, if it's a husband, he receives 1/2 if there's no children. If there are children, then it gets cut in half to 1/4. A wife, she will receive 1/4 as a default. If there are children involved, however, it gets cut into half to be 1/8. If there's a father and there's children, then he will receive 1/6. If there's a mother and there's children, he will receive 1/6. If there's a father but there's no children, then he becomes the asaba, so he no longer receives the 1/6, but rather he receives whatever remains over. If they're once all the universal inheritors have inherited, the mother, she receives 1/6. She receives 1/6, as we mentioned. She receives 1/3 if there are no children, and she receives 1/6 if there are children, meaning her child's, if they have children. And then the grandparents, they receive 1/6 or 1/12, but the grandparents only come into the picture if the mother and father are not there, because the mother and father would supersede them. So essentially, there are certain people who always inherit. So a spouse always inherits, children always inherit, and parents always inherit. Other relations outside of that, it just depends on if there's someone that will supersede them that's ahead of them. So brothers and sisters only come into account if there's no children. So if there's a children involved, if the deceased person has children, then the brothers and sisters, they don't receive any inheritance. And then it goes, and then there are, of course, more details to it, but that's like a basis in terms of inheritance. So you have the universal heirs, meaning those who have a fixed proportion that they always inherit, and then you have the asaba, who is, excuse me, well, the asaba would be, the translation would be the universal heir, but you have those who have a fixed inheritance. So they have, they are those who always inherit, and they have a certain percentage that they receive. And then you have the asaba, who is going to be the universal inheritor who receives whatever is left over. So this is why, because people always try to say that, Islam is not fair to women when it comes to inheritance, but actually there are many situations that can occur where a woman would actually inherit more than a man. The only time that is always definitely going to be the case is if it's a situation where a mother and father are both alive, or if the children of the deceased are both a brother and a sister are both alive. Because in that particular case, like a mother and father, like we mentioned, the father would either receive 1/3 or, well, actually, no, it's only in the case of brothers and sisters of the deceased, excuse me, of children of the deceased, when they're brothers and sisters. Because even there's situations where a wife might even inherit more than her husband. Because if it's a situation where you have a mother and a father, so they're married and their child dies and that child didn't have children, it could be a situation where after the mother gets her necessary 1/3, the remaining amount could be, and also after the siblings get their amount, it could be that the remaining amount is even less than the 1/3 that the mother got. So it's just that there's a system in place, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed, in terms of what is the percentage and who's going to be the asaba. And a single person without children or Muslim family, will we just outline Muslim organ? So in those, so some of the ulama have talked about that, because in an Islamic environment, what would happen is that if a Muslim dies and they don't have any inheritors whatsoever, technically speaking, the money would go to the Bayt al-Mal. It would go to the Muslim treasury. However, in a non-Muslim country, we don't have necessarily a Muslim treasury. So there are differences of opinions amongst the ulama about what should be done with that type of inheritance. But the actual fiqh ruling is that it would go to the Bayt al-Mal, the Muslim treasury. So in non-Muslim countries, it just becomes a situation of different, the different opinions that the ulama may have in regards to that. Our IRA haram, our life insurance, I would like to tell my family also why is riba haram. So all the different types of financial transactions, it depends on the transaction itself. So a basic principle is that if your way of gaining a profit is based upon interest, then that is going to be haram. Now, if it's going to be based upon investing, in that you receive a profit based upon a dividend, or the gains of the net profits from that business transaction, then it may be considered to be halal. However, it's a situation where you have to be very careful, because there's a very fine line between what is going to be considered to be halal and what's going to be considered haram, in terms of the many different financial tools that we have available today. So usually what I tell people is that if you're trying to do investing, the best thing to do is to talk to a scholar who is well versed in Islamic finance, and discuss the different transactions that you want to try to go into, so that you can know the parameters, as in what is going to be considered to be permissible, what is not going to be considered to be permissible. If I'm not mistaken, an IRA has to do is primarily based upon interest, and so if that's the case, then it's not going to be permissible. I don't remember all the details of all the different types of financial transactions, but I believe the IRA was one of those that was primarily interest based. But Allah knows best. I don't remember off the top of my head. Life insurance, there are different opinions that you may hear. The general position that I know of from my teachers is that if you are working at a job and that job naturally offers his employees life insurance, then it'll be considered to be permissible for your family to receive it, if something were to happen. It will be permissible for a family to receive it if something happened to the person who was working at that job, because this will be considered to be a gift, because you're not forced to take it and you don't have to contribute to it. In the case that a person is contributing to life insurance, then the precautionary position that I've heard from my teachers is that it would not be permissible. However, I know that I have heard of different opinions that other ulama have given, and so it's going to be a situation where there may be khilaf, there may be a difference of opinion on it. But if you wanted to be more precautious, then you wouldn't go out and buy additional life insurance, and Allah knows best. But at the same time, I'm trying to take the means of leaving your family behind something by making wise investments and the like. And why is riba haram? If I were to give like the short, almost if I wanted to give like the short, almost sarcastical answer, it would be because Allah said so. And I don't know if it's Sister Tahmina or not, but it seems like whoever it is, they kind of beat me to the punch. They mentioned the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mentioned specifically. But no, in reality, like, I jokingly say that because there are times where I do really want to say that. Like when someone asks, like, well, why is such and such is haram? Sometimes I really just want to say it because Allah said so. like whether or not I give you a reason that you feel good about or not, like at the end of the day, Allah doesn't have to give a reason. He could just say this is haram and khalas. It's like the end of the story. But kind of like Sister Danya is mentioning, is that the aspect of riba is that it's an aspect of oppression. So the aspect of riba is what? Is that I'm giving someone something in financially, generally speaking, when they're in a condition of financial hardship, and then I'm compounding on that you have to pay me more once it is the time around to pay me back. And then the other aspects of riba is that it's a system, and because there are different actually types of riba. So you have the riba in terms of like a loan where you are charging interest for a person taking out that loan. And then you have the aspect of riba from the standpoint of the person that's loaning it, as in addition to this aspect of oppression that you're placing on a person, you also have the aspect of you building wealth on top of wealth without putting any effort into it. Like, when you give this person money, yes, you may be taking a risk of that person paying you back or not, but essentially you're making money on top of money without there being any type of work within the economical society. So this is why riba also extends to foodstuffs, that, to trade dates for dates or barley for barley and so on and so forth, where the quantities are different, that is also considered to be a form of riba. So for example, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he once had seen that the companion Bilal had a large quantity of low-grade dates. And he went to the marketplace and he came back and he had a smaller quantity of high-quality dates. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he asked him, like, where did you get these high-quality dates? And Bilal had informed him that I traded the large quantity of low-quality dates that I had for the smaller quantity of high-quality dates. And the Prophet ﷺ informed Bilal that is riba. Go back, take back your large quantity of poor quality dates, and go and sell those low quality dates, get the money from that transaction, and then go purchase with the money those high quality dates. Now, a person may say, well, ultimately that's semantics, whatever case may be. But if you look at it, that's also increasing the economics within the society. Is that you're, and so there's also a benefit in economically in that there's more financial transactions that are taking place. So the thing is that again, at the end of the day, we can say that why is it haram? Because Allah said so. But yes, there are different wisdoms that the ulama mentioned to why riba is haram. Because ultimately there's no barakah in riba. There's barakah, there's blessing in buying and selling, but there's no barakah in riba. And again, riba is also considered to be a form of oppression. All right. So I see 2 in the chat. So we'll look at these 2. And then after that, I'm going to take a break for Salat al-Maghrib, and then we'll come back and finish up, inshallah. Is there a dua to get out of riba or debt? Yes, there is. There are actually multiple ones. And so Sister Danya put one into the chat. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hami wa hazan wa a'udhu bika min al-ajzi wa qasad wa a'udhu bika min al-jubni wa bukhul wa a'udhu bika min ghalabat al-dayni wa qadrihi rijal. And so that's definitely one. There's another one that's recommended to say before going to sleep at night, which is اللهم رب السماوات والأرضين وربنا ورب كل شيء فارق حب ونوى ومنزل القرآن ومنزل التوراة والإنجيل والقرآن اللهم إني أعوذ بك من اللهم it's always a situation where it's like when I actually have to say it like outside of when I normally say it, like my brain just kind of freezes. But just give me 1 second. اللهم إني أعوذ بك سبحان الله. And so once I find this, I'll be able to put in the chat as well, so people, because I understand that people will probably not be able to memorize this, just by me saying it once. So just give me a second, and I can pull it up, inshallah.
Do you know the dua?
And forgive me if people do not know the Arabic, but right now I only have the Arabic and the English translation. But if a person doesn't know the Arabic, then they can also recite an English translation. And again, this is recommended to be said before one goes to sleep. So this is the dua in Arabic. So like I mentioned, اللهم رب السماوات ورب الأرضين ربنا ورب كل شيء فارق حب والنوى ومنزل القرآن ومنزل التوراة والإنجيل والقرآن أعوذ بك من شر كل ذي شر أنت آخذ بناصيتي أنت أول فليس قبلك شيء وأنت آخر فليس بعدك شيء وظاهر فليس قبلك شيء وفوقك شيء وباطن فليس دونك شيء اقضي أني الدين وأخني من الفقر. So that is the Arabic of the particular dua. And this is the English translation of that particular dua as well. And again, it's recommended to say it before going to sleep at night. But yes, a person, even if you make a sincere dua from the heart, that is a means of du'as being answered. And so may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy. But again, there are also other du'as. in regards to indebtedness. And then the other aspect of indebtedness is to increase in one's dhikr so that the dunya becomes less and less important to one. Because generally speaking, we enter into a state of indebtedness because we are spending on aspects of the dunya. And so trying to get to a point where one lives below their means and don't have an overwhelming concern about aspects of the dunya, even from the standpoint of the foods that we eat, making our meals, fairly simple, and not worrying about eating the same thing over and over again and so on and so forth. These are other means of helping to remove ourselves from the state of indebtedness, and Allah knows best. And then there was one more before we break from Maghrib on participating in a non-Muslim wedding. So when it comes to the aspect of non-Muslim weddings, it could be possibly permissible to go as long as there's not going to be any haram things taking place. And the likelihood of that happening is not all that likely. But I mean, I remember Sheikh Tariq bin Sanina, he was asked one time even about going to a Muslim wedding, because someone was asking this, if you go to many Muslim weddings, there's haram that takes place. And Sheikh Tariq was basically saying, like, all Muslim weddings have haram taking place. but the basis in the sacred law is that when you receive an invitation to a wedding from a Muslim, then generally speaking, it's an obligation to respond to that invitation, unless you know that there's going to be haram taking place. Like if you know that they're going to have impermissible mixing between the genders, or if they're going to have alcohol being served or these type of things, then it will be no longer be an obligation for you to respond to that invitation. There are exceptions to that rule, like if it's at a far distance or something like that. But in general, you will be required to respond unless you know that there's going to be something permissible. So I mention that to say that if that's the case for a Muslim, then you kind of look at it like, well, a priority for a non-Muslim, if you know that it's going to be impermissible things happening, then it wouldn't necessarily be permissible to attend the wedding. So what I will sometimes do is that, because Islam will actually recognize the marriage of other traditions when they're not Muslim. So for example, with some of my relatives who have gotten married, I will go to the actual marriage ceremony itself, because oftentimes you won't have much of any haram that's taking place there. It's just the I do's. Like, of course they may be, quoting from the Bible or saying stuff like in Jesus' name and these type of things. But, those things could be more or less overlooked. And I just won't go to the reception. So, and the thing is that my family kind of knows me well enough now that I don't want to say this as like, it kind of sounds bad now that I'm like saying it out loud, but I don't even necessarily get invited to certain weddings because they just know that, yeah, I'm not going to come. So like, I guess to save money on the invitation and save money and save time on like me responding no, if I know that if they know they're going to have different things that I would consider to be impermissible, I don't get invited to many weddings outside of like maybe just the marriage ceremony itself. But generally speaking, I will not go to the reception afterwards, because especially with non-Muslims, usually alcohol is going to be involved, inappropriate dancing and mixing and stuff like that is going to be involved. So I don't attend. Wallahu a'lam. Okay, so now I'm going to break for Salat al-Maghrib, and then inshallah we'll finish up once we finish with Salat al-Maghrib, inshallah. Bismillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Alhamdulillah. Okay. So, and I'll probably end with this, and of course, Allah knows best of anyone's intention. And so there was a question that was posed on YouTube, and the question was, why was Aisha married I'm just going to say to the Prophet ﷺ, I wouldn't like to use that the what it mentions in the question in regards to the Prophet ﷺ. It's not, Allah knows best a person's intention, but essentially, why was Aisha married to the Prophet ﷺ, who was much older than her? That would probably be the better way that I would put it. And so, the reason why this is a question that people bring up and they struggle with, and they want to kind of see what answers the Muslims are going to give, and so on and so forth, is because we constantly, and this is basically human nature, is that we constantly judge other societies and people and situations based upon our own social context. And so what I mean by that is that we live in I don't know who the person is, I don't know where they're necessarily from, but I'll just mention from like my context. So we live in a American Western 21st century society. So there are many things that are culturally normal in our society today that we will consider the opposite of them to be abnormal. Whereas if we look at societies previously, some of the things that we do or say today will be looked at as completely abnormal. Like for example, and I'm not trying to open up the Pandora's box of controversial issues and so on and so forth, but I'm just being honest. Like if we want to be honest about the situation, then we can have you go back 100 years ago, right? Would it be fathomable that you would think that the Supreme Court of a country would be discussing what it means to be a woman? Like, would you think that would be like 100, people living 100 years ago? Do you think that they would think that would be something that a Supreme Court judicial system will be discussing? Like, we have to have a legal discussion about what it means to be a woman. And so, generally speaking, the answer will be no. But in our current cultural context that we live in today, that is a case that was just had. And they had just issued a ruling on that in the UK somewhere. So the thing is that we can't try to take our cultural context and supplant it into the cultural context of a completely different society, time, and normative manner of doing things. And when we try to do that, then we're going to end up in situations where we're going to say like, why did those people do this, or why did those people do that, and so on and so forth, when in those particular times and places, that was part of the normative aspects of society. Some of the things that people mention is that if you look at the critiques that people gave about the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in Islam, in those early periods of time, no one criticized the marriage of the Prophet ﷺ to Aisha radiallahu anha. And if you look at the marriage itself, Aisha describes a lot about her marriage with the Prophet ﷺ and is filled with nothing but love. And so not only that, but the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had the approval of the parents of Aisha radiallahu anha when she married the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And again, this was in the aspect of marriage. So again, we're trying to, and for the sake of time, I can't like go into all the different aspects of this particular thing, but one of the main things is this aspect of trying to supplant our, cultural norms onto a completely different society and time and way of doing things. You're talking about a society where someone who was 20 years old considered themselves to be old. And I'm basing this based upon when the Prophet ﷺ had proposed to one of his other wives. She had recently lost her husband, and the Prophet ﷺ had proposed to her, and she had responded initially by saying that, she was older, and that, she thought that that was kind of like a deficiency in terms of getting married to the Prophet ﷺ. But she was actually only in her 20s. But the reason why she said that she was older, because in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it was not uncommon for, or should I say, it was common for people not to live, that long. And so the thing is that that's part of the reason why people did things that we hold off on doing much earlier in life. So even, for example, when I went to Yemen, that if you take a child in Yemen in present day, our present day 21st century, and you compare them to a child from America, the children in Yemen are much more mature and take on much greater adult responsibilities than the children that we have in America. But again, it's a cultural difference in terms of how they raise their children, what they expose their children to, and so on and so forth. So you're talking about a completely different place, a completely different time, and the normative aspects of life during that time, and you're trying to compare it to our modern ways of doing things. And the reality of it is that it's an unfair comparison. Not to mention that, for example, the aspect that there's a difference of opinion about exactly what age Aisha was when she married the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. But at the same time, there was no physical intimacy with the Prophet ﷺ and Aisha until she was fully pubescent. And Allah knows best what age that was, but the general age that is considered to be the age of puberty, meaning that a person would generally be considered to have reached puberty, period, would be 15. And if you look from the standpoint of modern science, and I'm not even talking about, prior period science, but you look at modern science, the age that they say is the most ideal for a woman to have a child is between 16 and 22, I believe it is. That between the ages of 16 and 22, that's considered to be the most ideal age for a woman to have a child. And so if you want to get technical, in our modern day life where, a woman, might not even think about the aspect of having children until she's like 30 or something like that, it's like we're actually going against the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even created our natural bodies, is that, we have our children wait so long to get married and so on and so forth. But again, this there's no way that I, especially, this is like the last question all the way at the end, there's no way that I can like cover all the different aspects of it. But again, the most basic aspect of it is the aspect of trying to superimpose a completely different society and a completely different time with different values and trying to judge it based upon that. Because again, there's a lot of things that we can critique about, modern culture today, and so on and so forth. And so one thing, but the things that we can say about the blessed marriage of the Prophet ﷺ to Aisha is that that was a marriage that was sanctioned not only by the parents of Aisha, but the entire society around Mecca, even to the point of the people who were against the Messenger of Allah. Like, as I said, you look in the history, none of them tried to critique the Prophet based upon him marrying Aisha. Even in more modern times, people didn't try to critique the Prophet by his marriage to Aisha, because marrying at a young age was a normative practice until more modern times. You know, for example, if I would ask many of you, is that some of your grandparents, or, you know, if you're younger, some of your great grandparents, they probably got married at 16, 17, 15, and so on and so forth. My grandmother, she got married at, I think it was 17 when my grandmother got married. It was, and again, these were more normative aspects, that you would have people who would get married at younger ages. And then the aspect of age gaps, that was never a major issue in earlier times, is that as long as the two people were compatible, and in particular, as long as the woman's family gave their blessing for the marriage, that was considered to be something that was regularly accepted in society. So that is something very brief that we can say about the situation. But at the end of the day, you know, and this is not even taking into consideration the spiritual and the religious aspects to that blessed marriage. But again, we are not going to be able to go through, you know, all the different aspects of it. And may Allah forgive us for not even truly doing justice to it. But there is no controversy with the blessed marriage of the Prophet to Aisha. So inshallah, we will stop there. And inshallah, we hope to, you know, be with you all again next month for another Living Islam session. Please keep us all in your du'as, and we thank you for attending with us tonight. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. الله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم وحسبنا ونعم الوكيل. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.